Welcome back to the channel. Thank you very much for checking out this video. This will actually be a continuation of my oil testing series. And today we have Lake Speed Jr. on the channel talking with us about some results that I got from my 2019 6.7 Power Stroke. Lake, thanks so much for joining. We really appreciate having you here.
No, this is awesome, man. There's some really great little nuggets in your report, so I can't wait to jump into the details.
Yeah, we're really excited about it. And I know, for you as someone who's spent a lot of your life working as a tribologist, which for those of you who don't know what a tribologist is, they study friction and lubrication. For you now kind of moving into the space where you're offering a service for people with Speed Diagnostics, it'll be really cool to see, what we get in the report. Before we go there though, what caused you to start your YouTube channel, the Motor Oil Geek?
Well, as you said, I have a big history in racing. I was fortunate enough to work for Joe Gibbs Racing for 13 years. And during that time, FedEx, M&M's, Interstate Batteries, Home Depot, those guys never cared how much money we spent on oil. They only cared about winning races and winning championships. And oil analysis became one of the tools that we utilized to see where we were going. Because we did obviously engine teardowns, we did dyno testing, we did different tribology testing, but we also used the used oil analysis as one of our tools to determine if we were heading in the right direction, so we could have durability and be able to win races and win championships. And so as time went on, and I was no longer affiliated with a single oil company anymore, what really was kind of getting under my skin was seeing all these different videos people were putting out, and probably well-intentioned, but they just did not know the science behind the things they were talking about. So a lot of times they were misinterpreting the results. They didn't really know what they were looking at, so they didn't really give people the right answer. And I was like, man, I need to say something. So I started the Motor Oil Geek channel as a way of trying to say, hey, as someone that's actually formulated oils, that's worked with the people that actually make the molecules that go into oil. Because motor oil is only two things: it's base oil and additives. And we were fortunate enough to work with both Lubrizol and Afton, which are two of the four companies that actually make the additive packages that go into every brand of oil on the planet. We were able to work with the guys at Chevron Phillips, who are one of the base oil suppliers. So because of that, start the Motor Oil Geek as a way of sharing what the real tribology, what the real science of lubrication says, as an antidote, if you will, to the tribal knowledge, which is often incorrect in the industry.
Right. Yeah. And it seems like, so many times that tribal knowledge can be helpful or well-intentioned, like you said, but oftentimes is completely wrong. And so it seems like your goal with your YouTube channel, like you were saying, is to cut through that and to really give people the facts on oil.
Absolutely. I always said in the automotive industry, a lot of C- information gets repeated as gospel because it does work. I mean, it will pass the test, right? A C- is a passing grade.
Right.
It's not an A+. It doesn't mean you're the valedictorian. And what we see a lot of times is that C- information gets repeated around, and people accept it as what is the right answer, even though the correct answer, the better answer, isn't something that's common knowledge. And so we definitely want to try to bring that Victorian type information and make it widely available for folks. And one of the key steps in that is doing the used oil analysis, because you need data to make good decisions. Your Power Stroke, where you live and how you drive, is probably going to want something a little bit different. Someone else with that same vehicle that drives completely different, that maybe lives in, say, Nova Scotia, Canada, because your environmental impact in the application of that vehicle has a huge impact on how the oil is going to perform and how long it's going to last. Mm-hmm. There's so many variables that people don't realize are variables.
Right. And then it sounds like, when people often are trying to prescribe routines, without the facts, right, they end up prescribing something, ubiquitous, like a 3,000-mile oil change interval across the board under heavy duty use, or everyone's saying, 5,000 miles is the book. And essentially what you're saying is it's not 2, 3, 5, 10, 15,000 mile intervals. It is the testing that matters. You need to test to make sure that the interval that you're doing is right for you. It's not like a one size fits all approach.
Absolutely. I was fortunate enough to meet Don Smolinski and a couple other folks that worked with General Motors, the team that developed the GM oil life indicator system. They did this back in the 80s, because even back then they realized that a prescribed oil change interval, a set amount of miles, was still not adequate. In fact, one of the ladies on the team, her nickname was Sister Sludge. Her real name was Shirley Schwartz, and she, kind of famously within the tribology community, said that she could make anyone's oil fail in less than 3,000 miles. And she didn't do it by, towing a trailer in the desert or something like that. In her grandmother's car that lived in Green Bay, Wisconsin during January, because her grandmother would go, 1 mile to mass every morning and then 1 mile to the market every afternoon. That short trip driving in that cold weather conditions would generate excess fuel dilution, excess water contamination that could lead to sludge and basically destroy the oil quite quickly. So back to what we were saying is, if you're not testing, trusting, and that can leave you quite short in terms of making good educated decisions, because the goal of used oil analysis is getting the proper oil change interval, getting the right lubricant in the vehicle, because not every oil is going to behave the same in all the different environments. Some oils are going to work better in, we'll call it engine X, than it will in engine Y. And it could be that in condition Z, it works best, but in condition G, B best, even though it's the same engine. It's just, there's all these variables that people don't realize are variables, and oil analysis gives the ability to have data and make data-driven decisions, which are typically a better decision than trusting someone on the internet.
Yeah, right, exactly. Even though the internet people are well-intentioned, they often make mistakes, just like anyone else.
Absolutely. The thing is, even as an oil analyst, I'm still kind of like the kid that's watching the parade, pothole in the fence. It's coming in front of me, but I can't see the big picture.
Right.
And it's almost like if you don't have oil analysis, like you're standing there behind the fence and you don't even have a knothole to look through, and you're just relying on someone else to tell you what's happening, and you're telling everybody else. The oil analysis report is incredibly important. It's going to give you a lot of information, but you have to rely on your own experience as well. What you felt and seen, all that comes together, a really good picture of what's going on. That way you can make the right decision for you in your environment.
Awesome. Well, why don't we take a look at that picture, so to speak,
Sure.
that you mentioned.
This up here. I think I can share my screen here real quick.
If you're new to the channel and this is the first video that you're seeing, I've filmed 2 videos prior to this where I did oil testing with another company. So I had a little inclination as to what was going on. You will see on here that I ran my oil in this test up to 9,109 miles. And prior to that, I had been running 5,000 mile oil change intervals religiously. Sometimes I would change my oil at 4,000 miles because I very much was in the camp of, I prefer sooner rather than later. I want to be over the top. But what I soon realized when running the Amsoil signature series, their 5W40, was that I was dumping a lot of perfectly good oil down the drain for no reason.
Yep. Yeah, you don't want to be in the maintenance-induced failure category. That's actually, the used oil analysis was pioneered by the U.S. Navy. They did it during World War II for aircraft and things. And what they realized was that the fewer times they had to do scheduled maintenance, the fewer failures they had overall. Because every time you would open that engine up to do any kind of work on it, there was an opportunity for contamination or something not to be tightened back correctly or whatever it is, that maintenance induced failure. So if you can do predictive maintenance, let the oil analysis tell you when you should do maintenance, you're going to reduce the likelihood of a maintenance induced failure. So overall, your fleet life should go up, does go up when you do used oil analysis for that very reason.
Yeah, that's something that you wouldn't have thought. And you've mentioned too how now, oil analysis still isn't really common in automotive, but with commercial airlines, commercial shipping, basically every other industry uses oil analysis for vehicles that have to perform consistently day in and day out, but somehow it just hasn't quite made it to consumer automotive yet.
Yeah. The U.S. military lives and dies on used oil analysis. Nuclear power plants live and die on used oil analysis. The whole rest of the world, other than the automotive sector, if you have high value equipment doing really important tasks, they're doing used oil analysis. But in the automotive industry, consumer automotive industry, it is pretty rare for someone to pick up and utilize this technology, which is very affordable and very accessible, actually. But it is whatever people want to do. But if you really care about your vehicle and you want to get the life out of it, this is a really good tool. It's going to be worth your investment to do it. You start, to your point, when you're changing that oil at 4,000 to 5,000 miles, you easily doubled drain interval here. So you basically cut your cost of oil in half by doing a few oil tests to be able to determine, hey, I can go this far. And I'll tell you right now, just looking at the oxidation value from the new oil to your used oil, it went from 11 to 17. It's a pretty small change. Mm-hmm. You can go further. Now, oxidation isn't linear. Just because it only went from 11 to 17 and basically doubling the oxidation value is a typically a point where you want to say, okay, that's probably about enough. You could go a little bit further, but to be safe, okay, well, we only picked it up 6 and we're only basically halfway there. You could double that further and go to 18. No, it doesn't work that way. It's not linear. But I would say, try 11,000 miles. So that's an easy way of seeing right there that you could pretty easily pay for used oil analysis just on the savings of having to do oil changes that didn't need to be done that actually could have potentially hurt the engine by accident. So,
right. No, and if you're buying expensive oil too, even with my discount on Amsoil, I have like a member discount. I'm probably spending a little under $200 for a filter, all the oil. It's not super cheap, but if you're able to run that oil for 11, 12,000 miles and you just are doing the used oil analysis, because I think for Speed Diagnostics, it's for the standard turnaround, the 7-day turnaround, it's $60 for the test, $10 for shipping, like pretty straightforward. So if you think if I'm able to double, triple, quadruple the number of miles I'm doing, I'm saving hundreds of dollars just by paying for used oil analysis. So it is
right.
Not to mention you're saving your engine because now you know what's going on inside. So
you can begin to make better educated decisions. One of the things you can see from yours is that you have a elevated level of fuel dilution. So not only were you able to get some value from the used oil analysis by extending the drain interval, but it's now also brought to your attention an underlying problem you can address before it becomes really expensive. Because if fuel dilution continues to persist and increase, you're going to end up losing the rod bearing eventually. And that's really expensive compared to what I think you said you had to do to actually fix this problem.
Yeah. So if you haven't been following some of my shorts here on YouTube, the backstory is I got an engine code, which was a P2459, and that is a regen frequency code. So for any truck that has a DPF it has a pressure sensor that monitors the DPF pressure differential. When it gets to a certain threshold, that's what triggers the regeneration process. And Ford says a normal regen interval is like 100 to 500 miles. It's a really big range, but I had noticed that the range had gotten considerably smaller from where it had been farther. So I typically, for me, a normal regeneration is happening between 350 and 550 miles. It's kind of near the high end. And they had been happening every 150 miles. And I knew that because I had the operator commanded regen turned on my dashboard. So I was monitoring that. And on top of that, I didn't think much of it until I got the oil analysis back and I saw that there was excessive fuel dilution. And when you're regenning that often, you're burning a lot of extra fuel. So I was able to fix that pressure sensor. It was a $150 part, and my fuel economy went back up. And I'm going to be doing another test here in the next few weeks to see, where the fuel dilution's at, and then we'll be able to kind of check back on that. I wouldn't have had as much concrete evidence as I did. I kind of had a hint because I had OCR turned on, but I can't imagine, like, for someone who doesn't have OCR turned on their dash and they're not doing oil analysis, like, you're completely flying blind. Your truck could just be looping in regens and get totally plugged up, or you could have sensors failing and you wouldn't know. And so this, it's just a tremendous tool.
Oh, yeah, the power strokes are known for making oil. Like, you can be in the oil industry if you have a power stroke, because typically those oil levels go up, but this is one of the reasons why, right? Is that if that sensor tends to be sensitive and maybe it is more prone to having a problem, then you could be having this issue, damaging your engine without your knowledge. But back to what we said earlier, by the fact that you had the oil analysis, but you also had the OCR going on, you were able to take multiple points of data and draw a clear picture of what that problem actually is. Then you didn't waste time and money throwing parts at it. So you were able to kind of surgically go in there, fix the problem, and get back going, and be able to reap the benefits of better fuel economy and better engine life. Because fuel is the enemy of your oil, 100%. When you start putting that much fuel into the oil, you're gonna kill the oil, and you're going to increase engine wear. So I think what's really neat here would be to see when you get back around and that fuel dilution goes back down, to see what happens with those wear numbers. Because I think you'll find the wear numbers can get even better, even though they're not bad. 5 parts per million, 1,000 miles is actually kind of right on spec. You want to be that or below. So you're at the very high end of the good range, but it'd be interesting to see if you can't get that down lower as you get rid of the fuel dilution.
Right. Yeah, and then the other thing that you had flagged here too was the potassium, which I think, we had talked offline. Some of that was from the fact that I've been running Archoil's oil additive, which does have really high boron and potassium content. So I think that's a little residue that's left. But then in the notes, you had also asked whether or not I was using any fuel additives, which also could be a possible source of the potassium. And I do run pretty religiously Archoil's diesel fuel system treatment there. They call it AR 6500. And so I also think that maybe that could be from there. I try to, I don't overdose. It's funny. I think some people think that, especially with cetane and diesel added, more is more. But it's once you reach a certain cetane rating, it just doesn't do anything else to
it's diminishing returns.
Right. So I'm pretty good with measuring it out, but I think that also could be kind of where that higher potassium level could have been from. And so I'm interested to see with the next test, where that number will be.
Absolutely, because we see that pretty common, that when you have some of these fuel additives, especially some of the oil additives, do contain potassium. And there's a couple of reasons why I'm not I'll call it a giant fan of those. One, you don't want to mask a problem. So most coolant are going to contain potassium and sodium. So that's why potassium is listed over here in the contaminant section on the report, is because we want to make sure that if we see potassium and sodium, we know that there's a coolant leak. Because you can have a coolant leak that doesn't show any water, doesn't show any glycol. if you have a small head gasket leak that's only going into the combustion chamber, that small amount of water, small amount of glycol can be burned off. Be left behind is the potassium and sodium that gets mixed into the oil. Now, that little bit of increase in sodium here, that's nothing, right? You're going to need to be in the sodium levels of 50, 60 plus compared to what the new was to be anything alarm. So I wasn't concerned about a coolant leak with the potassium because that level of sodium, which is why I asked, hey, are you using a fuel additive? Because I suspected that's where it would be coming from. But the only other issue, though, with potassium is that it is a metallic. So it is something that is, not combustible. So what happens is, back to your DPF, a high level of potassium, a high level of sodium, a high level of calcium or magnesium or zinc or phosphorus, any of these metal components that can be in the oil, that's ash that plugs up the DPF. It's going to cause it to need to regen. It's going to cause it to fail shorter in time than if not. So with these newer vehicles that have DPFs and you're trying to protect the emissions control equipment, it's really important to minimize the amount of extra stuff you're putting in the oil in order to make sure that you're getting the proper life and function out of the after treatment systems.
Right. And that's the biggest concern most owners have with these Power Strokes is the emissions stuff. It's the CP4 pump, and then it's the emissions equipment. And so, that's a great point.
If you're at or below 5 parts per million per 1,000 miles, you're good. You don't need to add anything else to your oil or do anything different.
Right.
You can optimize that drain interval, try to get it right. But that's a good place to be. I always say that's where you need to start, right? The way to be the C student is to start off with, what does the manufacturer say? Follow that. Full analysis, you can then figure out what to do next. Now, adding a fuel additive, everything about fuel additives is they stay in the system for a while. So, especially for injector cleanliness, that's a big deal. But you don't need to use it every tank. You can use it probably every 3,000 to 4,000 miles, and it will still keep the injectors clean. So you can have a less amount of money being spent on fuel additives that way, because the oil analysis is going to tell you if the injectors are dirty. It's going to tell you the wear rate. Then if you maybe say, oh, you know what, maybe I'm around 6 or 7 parts per million now using the OEM oil, doing it this way. Let me try this synthetic oil, like the Amsoil, and see if it work better. Run a couple of cycles through it, because it takes 2 to 3 oil changes to get all the other stuff removed out of the system. And then for you to really know what it's really going to do without anything competing against it, if the number goes down, man, you're good. If you get below that 5 parts per million, you're in a good spot. Then it's just called maintenance mode. You don't need to be creative at that point. If you can get below that point, and that's what we try to do at Speed Diagnostics, is help our customers, determine what that wear rate is. And when there's guidance needed, we give them the guidance to go in a direction to try to get it below it, because it's not about what brand it is. Engines can't read labels. They don't care about brands. They care about chemistry. If you use the right chemistry for your application and change it at the correct interval, you're going to get great results.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. And it seems like I'm trending in the right direction, but
Absolutely.
I guess we'll see. If we'll try that 11 to 12,000 for my next oil change interval, and then we'll bring it back and see where the wear is at. It sounds like what you're saying is a lot of the power with this comes from doing that trend analysis, not just doing a one hit. It's like having the multiple data points.
Absolutely. The picture becomes clearer the more data points you have. If you just take a sample every once in a while, it's going to take a longer time to get a bigger picture, and you're going to be missing chunks of data in between. So by doing what you're doing, you're building that trend analysis, you're getting a clearer picture, and then you can, back to what I said earlier, you're empowered to make your own decisions. You know how you're driving the vehicle. You know what it's sounding like and what it's doing. and you're seeing the oil when it comes right out of the engine and everything else about it. Now your full understanding of what's happening with the oil, with your engine is much better, and you're going to make better decisions. They're going to lead to lower cost and longer life because you're empowered. You have that ability. The trend analysis is absolutely a critical part of this, and it's what really is where the power comes from, I believe.
Yeah, yeah, no, certainly. I have two more questions for you before we close. The first was you had mentioned that story that passed around in tribologist circles about the person who would kill oil before 3,000 miles. And I was curious what sort of relationship there is between vehicles that spend more time at operating temperature versus vehicles that don't. So I know oils in general are designed to run at certain temperatures better than at others, but like they're also needing to perform some level of, cold wear, cold start protection. So could you speak to that relationship a little bit and how, just how temperature that the oil's running at kind of impacts engine wear and how the motor's running?
Well, the key word is balance. If you have excessive low temperature operation, it's going to shorten the life of the oil because you're not able to evaporate out the contaminants, be it fuel or water that builds up in the system. Water comes from combustion. Alternatively, if you operate at very high temperatures, you're also going to get a shorter life. So ideally, you'd like to be in that 220, 240 degree oil temperature range. That's a hot enough temperature to evaporate everything out. All the additives are going to be super happy working in that range. The antioxidants aren't going to be being consumed too quickly. So, that's an ideal temperature range. So it's one of the things where if you have engines that do a lot of idle time, it's typically harder on the oil because you're getting a lot of fuel in the oil. You're typically not getting the engine really, so you tend to get more contamination just because you're just not able to run the engine up. Piston rings, for example, I work for a piston ring company. That's my day job. Piston rings work not just from their static tension. It's cylinder pressure. When you're idling, you don't have a lot of cylinder pressure, so you don't get as good a ring seal. So you're going to get more blow by than if you're actually operating the engine at a higher torque value. Now you have more cylinder pressure, which is forcing the rings out, and you're getting better ring seal. So again, there's all these little variables. Hopefully that kind of answers your question that, you really want to be cognizant of how you operate your engine. Ideally, you want to get it into a good temperature range, keep it there, and then use it. Don't let it just sit there and idle. That's not a good thing for the engine.
Yeah, so it sounds like if you're able to hit that kind of optimum temperature range, the more often you're running it in that, the better it is for the engine, the better it is for the oil.
Oh, yeah. That GM oil life system actually has a debit credit system built into it that your oil life will be debited on it at low temperature. It will also debit it if you run it at too high of a temperature. But in that normal range, you're actually getting credits back.
Wow.
If you clean the engine oil up a little bit, if you get all that crap out, it will basically give it back some. So it's pretty, it's amazing stuff. I'm actually gonna make a video about it one day.
Cool. Yeah.
Because it's some pretty cool stuff the guys shared with me about how they figured all this stuff out.
So my last question is, how best should people interact with used oil analysis? This question was one coming from my brother. He has a smaller YouTube channel. He's a mechanic, and he loves your videos, but he was curious, what is the best way for someone to interact with used oil analysis and your YouTube channel?
Well, back to what we said earlier about you want to use it as part of the bigger picture. In your example where you were able to find the fuel dilution problem and find that sensor, you weren't relying just on the oil analysis data for that. You also were using, other points of data you could access from the vehicle. So what I say with used oil analysis is the best way to interact with it is to use that piece of information, but balance it with the other things that you can measure from the engine. If you have the ability to plug into the OBD2 port and pick some information out of there, that's great, because the more points of data you can put together and triangulate and make sense of all of it, the better off you are in terms of being able to pinpoint a problem address the problem, solve the problem, or in some cases, be able to detect something that's beginning to come up and then move around it. Basically, maybe is it changing your oil change interval, or changing the type of fuel you're using or the additive you're using, whatever it is. You can base all that. You want to utilize that data as part of it, but also, like you mentioned, don't just take one. You want to commit to picking up data on a regular basis, and then utilize that trend analysis, that personalized data set, if you will, to make decisions. For example, there's every lab's going to have basically the universal standard, which is basically based on a diesel engine running about the equivalency of 10,000 miles. That's the standard. And that will work in most cases, but there's always going to be outliers. And when you have your data and you have your own trend analysis, then you can begin to respond to the deviations that are beyond a one standard deviation. We actually have the trend analysis feature, and we are using statistical methods in there. So we will only flag something that moves if it goes beyond one standard deviation. Because if it's less than one standard deviation, then it's just the noise. We don't care about that. Mm-hmm. We want to see, does it go beyond that? If it goes beyond that, okay, now we need to pay attention to what's going on here. So that's part of what we do, is we try to help. It's not just that we're giving you data. We're also trying to help give you the tools to empower you to make good decisions as well.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. You have to have that whole picture. And by having, the oil analysis and everything, it's like, instead of looking through the fence, it's like you built a ladder to see over this, not to overuse that.
No, I like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're getting the whole picture for yourself instead of just taking shots in the dark. Well, thank you so much, Blake. I appreciate you coming on the channel to talk about this topic. It's super important. It's important to me personally, just because with my business and how much I drive, like, this is a tremendous asset and it puts money back in my pocket, but it's also great for the channel. The goal here is I'm really trying to build a community of people that care about taking care of their vehicles and running them for a long time, but using them, using them hard to work and for play. I have folks that use their trucks for both. And so, we want to take care of them, but this is a tremendous resource. And check out Speed Diagnostic. They're doing this testing as a service, and it is just an incredible value and a look into what's going on in your engine. So, Blake, thank you again. Really appreciate it. And
glad we get together and make it happen. And hopefully this is beneficial for everybody watching. They learned a few things they didn't maybe know before, and help them kind of, open their mind and be able to make better decisions going forward.
Definitely. Well, if you haven't yet already, please subscribe. I'll be doing more videos on my oil testing. Blake, thank you again, and we'll see you next time on Power Stroke Maintenance.